Hi, and welcome to 𝗿𝗶𝗴𝗍, the channel comprised of two really funny fruits that hate the robot voice. That's right, I said two, because we are not one, but two fruits. Anyways, I am Peach and the other individual. Anyways, I am Peach.
And I am not Peach.
That is why you also may notice that the editing style is slightly different for this video. So we just wanted to make a follow-up video to respond to some of the critique we've seen against kaachi and expand on some more of the things that we brought up in the first video. Specifically in this video, we're going to talk about Asian representation and cultural appropriation.
And then in my part, I'm going to discuss some common logical fallacies that weaken arguments. Also, 如果你 是我们
两个人都是中国人，所以你们在 comment section
在 comment section 叫我们在 fetishize Asian people 亚洲的人。我们也要说一下，如果你不是一个韩国人，不应该决定谁可以还是不可以做成一个 K-pop idol. Anyway, also in this video we're going to be talking about some slightly more touchy subject matter compared to the first video, so we would kindly ask you to watch the whole video before commenting your opinion below.
Hello, so today we're going to be talking about two main issues I've seen brought up a lot. The first is Asian representation, and the second is cultural appropriation, which sort of ties into 𝗃𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗏 behavior. Now, before we begin, I'd just like to once again establish that, yes, I am Chinese, I've grown up in the West my entire life, I've faced the usual stereotypical comments about my ethnicity, and I've also written and presented a speech about Asian representation for a national speech qualifiers tournament. So I think that just between my personal experience as well as the research I've done on this topic, I do think I have some credibility when talking about these issues. So let's first talk about Asian representation, and the bulk of these problems lies primarily in the West, especially regarding the film and cinema industry. Some of the problems that we see in the status quo are a lack of opportunity given to Asians, and many Asian roles going to non-Asian actors or being whitewashed entirely, so essentially non-Asians are being cast to represent Asian narratives. Another problem that was much more prominent in the past was yellowface, but we also see this resurface in less invasive ways in the status quo. Fundamentally, a lack of Asian representation hinges on the idea that non-Asians are actively detracting attention away from Asians. And a lot of this really stems from systemic racial bias against Asians. However, this isn't really the case in K-pop. If you think that kaachi are infringing on Asian representation, you're essentially saying that every non-Asian working in an Asian entertainment industry is bolstering a lack of Asian representation, which isn't even true. Because here's the thing, these groups aren't actively taking recognition away from established K-pop groups or winning any awards that should have gone to an Asian idol. This would be a completely different case if entertainment companies were actively favoring Westerners over Asians, which isn't the case at all. The discussion of Asian representation isn't really applicable here because in the West, Westerners obviously hold higher up positions in entertainment companies and can exercise discrimination against Asian individuals. But there isn't really a way for Korean entertainment companies to actively discriminate against Koreans or Asians in order to favor Westerners. Also, another point I don't really see a lot of people take into consideration is that these are Koreans making these Western K-pop groups. Once again, it would be a completely different story if it was Westerners creating these groups and trying to leverage in on the popularity and success of K-pop. I think more people should ask themselves before they make an opinion or a judgment on these groups as to why Koreans are making these groups if they think that K-pop is fundamentally only an Asian thing. But I can totally understand where all of these comments about Asian representation is coming from, because I think it stems from how Asians are treated as a minority in the West and face discrimination and stereotypes, but I don't really think those arguments really work when you shift the context to the Korean music industry. This is a really touchy subject when you consider just how little representation we see in the West and how often Asians just get screwed over in terms of media representation. And also, I know a lot of people will use K-pop as a form of escapism from perhaps the things that we see in the West. But once again, just consider the context that you're making these arguments about. Now let's talk about cultural appropriation, a very general definition for a very complex topic, alternatively known as the Wikipedia definition. Cultural appropriation is the adoption of elements of one culture by members of another culture. This can be controversial when members of a dominant culture appropriate from disadvantaged minority cultures. So a huge part of cultural appropriation lies upon this idea of taking symbolism, clothing, what have you, from another culture with little respect or knowledge towards the significance of those things. Usually members of a dominant culture who culturally appropriate are seen as quote-unquote cooler or trendier. Personally, I don't really see kaachi or Western K-pop groups as a form of cultural appropriation. Now, hear me out. Most of it is primarily because K-pop is just so far removed from traditional Korean culture. Yes, obviously it is a form of pop culture that is very pertinent in Korea in the status quo, but it's almost like saying that Mandopop or C-pop is representative of China's rich history and offers nuance into their culture. Like, Luhan is not giving in-depth philosophical retellings of the Qing dynasty or using heavy cultural symbolism in his music. And another funny thing is that in the past, I've seen a lot of people argue that liking K-pop doesn't mean you know everything about Korea and its culture, and that argument still applies here. So fundamentally, I don't really see it as a form of cultural appropriation because K-pop as a whole doesn't really represent Korea's culture. In fact, K-pop heavily suffers from cultural appropriation itself, which further distances it from Korean culture, but that is a very different topic which I am not going to go in depth into in this video. I do acknowledge that most of the times when fans are talking about cultural appropriation, they're usually referring to these idol personalities that these Western idols tend to adopt. And this is even something I brought up in my previous video and I actually complained about. Most of the arguments I've seen about kaachi being 𝗶𝗵𝗶𝗲 really stems on this idea in particular. But once again, I don't really see idol personalities as a form of cultural appropriation because people aren't being actively discriminated against for acting like an idol or having that sort of personality. People aren't getting hate or rude comments about this. And it isn't really like Western idols who are adopting these personalities are being hailed as trendier or cooler than Asian idols. Now, is it insensitive and disrespectful to pretend to act like a person from another culture without having at least some knowledge about their culture themselves? Yes, totally 1000%. But would I really go so far as to call it a form of cultural appropriation? No. And honestly, this is just what I've seen personally. I just don't think that the behavior shown by kaachi is even extreme 𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗲 behavior. I've seen a lot of accusations about the things that the members have done, but so far I haven't really been presented with concrete evidence or screenshots. And for now, because of the limited knowledge I have about kaachi and the members themselves, I'm just gonna choose not to really make any accusations against them. I think if there is one thing you choose to take away from all of this, it's that this isn't a cut and dry issue that people should be so quick to draw conclusions from. And especially because these issues are so complex and have so much nuance to them, I really implore you to think twice before you use loaded terms on social media to sort of describe the behavior of kaachi or Western K-pop groups. I know it's so easy to want to throw around terms like colonialism or Asian representation or cultural appropriation, but so many of those terms have been overused and misused to the extent that they're losing the true definition of what those words mean. And I think we've gotten to the point where we're categorizing everything as cultural appropriation, which is pretty worrisome, to be completely honest with you. So those are my thoughts on some of the arguments we've seen against kaachi. Now we're going to move on to Orange's segment, where we talk about logical fallacies.
Welcome to Literacy with Orange. We're learning about logical fallacies and how to construct valid arguments in a civil debate. I'm going to go over the ones that I see most commonly in the comments and on Twitter so that hopefully we can all have more productive discourse. The first one is known as ad hominem, when you attack the person who is making the argument rather than the argument itself. For example, we have two Twitter users, and the first one says, "I think this celebrity is problematic because of this." And then our Twitter user 2 comes in and says, "Well, you don't stan Luna, so your opinion's invalid." It's completely ridiculous, immature, and unproductive to insult people who you don't agree with. I'm sure 99% of people watching know this, but it can't be said enough with the amount of harassment that occurs online thanks to anonymity. So the next one is 𝗃𝗶𝗴𝗿𝗆, which is responding to criticism with more criticism. This is like walking up to some people talking on the street and they're discussing which of these two TVXQ members are hotter, and you go up to them and ask why they're so focused on the physical aspects of unrealistic and unattainably idolized beauty, rather than living life and finding someone who is attractive on the inside and completes you as a human being. Like, yes, idols are entertainers, but that's a different conversation. You can have those discussions based on your criticisms later, since forcing them into other issues will muddy up everything and then nothing will be accomplished. It's already hard enough to talk about one topic on the internet, let alone the 20 that spawned from the first one. Next we have the straw man, where you simplify an argument to make it easier to rebut. So, for example, you might see on Twitter, user 1 says, "I think that this company should use more funds for that group instead of this group." To which another Twitter user responds, "Do you want this group to flop?" No, that's not what user 1 said, and you're making a fool of yourself if you say this. Peach mentioned to me that the character limit on Twitter could also contribute to this. It's much easier to make wide and sweeping statements and nuanced arguments when you can't even fit the first verse of 𝗃𝗵𝗶𝗀𝗏 in a tweet. The last logical fallacy I'm going to talk about is the genetic fallacy, where something is inherently bad because of where it comes from. I don't think this is hard to understand, it's just hard to overcome one's knee-jerk reaction to something that counters the norm. I feel dumb saying this, but please try to understand things from a neutral standpoint before picking up your hashtags. Echo chambers ain't new. Of course, you think you're correct, and you probably are inside of your world bubble. That's just how the human mind is. However, what you say and do on the internet isn't confined to just your corner, so you should be mindful of what you put out there, and how other people who may be objectively more qualified to speak on certain matters than you are may react. Obviously, you don't have to listen to me or Peach, as what we say should be analyzed under the same scrutiny as anything you see on the internet. But we did our best to remain neutral and purely informative while proving our points. We probably won't return to kaachi on the channel unless some crazy new development happens, but to all of our new subscribers, thank you for considering our channel.
Thank you. We hope you haven't hated us by this point. We work really hard on these videos. We hope you choose to stick around and
don't subscribe, don't do it, don't subscribe, don't subscribe, don't subscribe,
do not
don't subscribe, don't subscribe, don't subscribe, don't subscribe. And definitely do not hit like on this video.
If you enjoyed it, such as weighing that thing.
That's right. Collab brought to you by social distancing.
So that's why the audio sucks right now.
Yeah.